Okay, I'm going to try and finish up this discussion on acronyms and standards. In the last lecture, I left off with my discussion on ISO 9000, that international quality standard. I had one student ask me, Shima, could I be great at quality and not be able to get ISO 9000 certified? And I said, yeah, absolutely. In fact, that's often the case with some small to medium-sized firms where they just do what they do very well. But because they're not obsessed with policies and procedures and documentation, and they use a lot of tribal knowledge, yeah, they can't get ISO 9000 certified. So sometimes that is an issue with some of their customers, and then it just depends on the customer. Hey, I can't do business with you unless you are ISO 9000 certified, or maybe I'll come into your facilities, and if you can prove to me that you are great at quality, maybe I can allow you to self-declare, so to speak, and not have to pay for a rubber stamp and take on that administrative burden of managing systems and documentation that can be very expensive. And for small to medium-sized firms that only employ 100 to 1,000 people, and you're dedicating 1 to 10 people full-time to track and keep up with the documentation associated with ISO 9000 certification, it could be very non-value added. But again, in general, it adds a lot of value, I think, if you do it the right way for the right reasons, and the right reasons are to continuously improve and do things better, faster, and cheaper. I did have one person ask, could you be ISO 9000 certified and kind of stink at quality? And I had to think about that a little bit. So think about that means you're ISO 9000 certified. You've proven to someone outside of your company, an auditor that's licensed and trained to do this for a living, where they come in with a rubber stamp and says, prove to me you're ISO 9000 certified. So let's say you have policies and procedures in place for everything from beginning to end as it pertains to quality. You measure anything and everything associated with quality. All of your employees are trained, they understand what their job responsibilities are, and they do things the way they're supposed to. And when things happen, they know what to do and they do it the right way. Now, in that situation, could you still stink at quality? Technically, yes, I think you could. But at the same time, if you go through that process of doing all of those things and getting ISO 9000 certified, what's implied is that maybe you weren't starting off in a good place with quality, but hopefully because of the ISO 9000 certification process, you get better and better at quality. And there's enough data out there that says, yeah, this stuff actually works. And I think intuitively, conceptually, you would say, well, that just makes a lot of sense why it would work. Okay, so I'm going to try to move away from this ISO 9000 stuff. I'm going to wrap it up with, we are in Michigan. A lot of our economy revolves around the auto industry. So what's happened in the auto industry is they went from their own standards to an industry standard. So they went from GM, Ford, and Chrysler to having their own separate standards, 3 different ones. And then they created one for themselves called QS 9000. And then the other automotive OEMs, especially the Germans and the European ones, embraced QS 9000, so they all started to use it. Now they're using a new one called IATF 16949. That stands for the International Automotive Task Force, and 16949 is just a number that has roots in German auto standards. Okay, so that's the new International Automotive Quality Standard. Basically, it's ISO 9000 customized for the auto industry, and they keep tweaking it and making it more customized for the auto industry. Then they keep adding stuff to it as priorities change. For example, right now with IATF 16949, if you asked me what's the biggest difference between this and previous quality standards in the auto industry like QS 9000, this requires risk management now, whereas in the past a lot of emphasis and priority wasn't placed in risk management. So obviously what happened was the OEMs wanted to get stuff from their first tiers, but the first tiers weren't getting stuff from their suppliers because something was happening downstream in the supply chain. In other words, the OEMs in the first tiers didn't have a lot of visibility in their supply chain with the second, third, and fourth tier suppliers, and that was shutting factories down for first tiers and the actual automotive OEMs themselves. So they said, hey, we're going to get all of our facilities certified to this new standard, and we're going to start taking visibility and risk management more seriously and approach it more proactively, and we're going to require the same thing of our suppliers and make their suppliers required of their suppliers and so forth, so that everyone within the automotive supply chain is placing an increased emphasis on risk and being more proactive. Okay. All right, so moving on, the other ISO standards. Now you kind of know what ISO is. So if I say ISO 14000, that addresses pollution, waste, and the environment. The idea is if you have policies and procedures in place and systems and documentation on how to manage waste and pollution, and you have to measure the heck out of it, what's implied by that is you're going to pollute less. Okay, so there's ISO 14000 certification. ISO 9000 was created in 1987. ISO 14000 was created in 1996. And similarly, it took off in Europe and eventually made its way to the United States. And right now, globally speaking, there are millions of facilities that are ISO 14000 and ISO 9000 certified. So it's everywhere. In general, most of the companies that recruit from the ISM program, all of their facilities will be ISO 9000 and ISO 14000 certified. The other ISO standards are 31000, one dedicated completely to risk. So if you need a risk management system or framework, let's say you go hire on with a company and they decide, you know what, we just don't proactively manage risk. In fact, we don't have any sort of system in place to address risk and manage it. You could say to your employer, well, ISO has a risk management framework and standards called ISO 31000. It provides a general framework for creating a risk management system. And the other big ones are 26,000, which addresses social responsibility. I just find it strange that these people in Geneva, Switzerland are kind of showing everyone else in the global economy how to be socially responsible. But hey, maybe there are companies out there that don't want to reinvent the wheel. Maybe they need help with this stuff. And again, this ISO stuff, they're kind of the same across all standards. They just kind of zap in the strategic initiative buzzword. Like this one's for quality, this one's for pollution, this one's for risk management. But in essence, they kind of say and do the same thing. Are you measuring like crazy? Do you train your employees? Do they understand what their job responsibilities are in regards to that strategic initiative like quality, pollution, risk? So it's kind of all the same. It's just addressing a different topic area. ISO 22000 is specific to food safety management for those companies and industries where if they screw up on quality, people die. And then ISO 50000, which is specific to energy, like using less of it. And obviously, if you measure it and have policies and procedures in place and people understand their roles and responsibilities for using energy, maybe you'll actually use energy more efficiently. So enough on the ISO standards. Do you feel like in general you get what they are? You need to, because you'll see it everywhere. Someone will give you a business card and it'll say they're ISO 9000 certified or they're IATF 16949 certified. If you work in the medical device industry, if you're a Stryker, if you're a supplier to Stryker, your business card is going to say we're ISO 13485 certified. That's the quality standard and management system specific and customized for the medical device manufacturing industry. You'll drive down the highway and you'll see all these factories with these signs that say we're ISO 14000 certified, or you'll see someone's email postscript that says we're ISO 31000 certified. Those all mean things in regards to a strategic initiative that proves that we take this seriously and we're probably pretty good at it as well. Okay, I'm going to fly through the rest of the acronyms rather quickly. The first one is SA8000. At the top there, SA8000. There are certain companies in certain industries where they subcontract all of their manufacturing, and they tend to subcontract it to places where there might be sweatshops. So for example, the athletic apparel industry, they don't actually make anything themselves. They subcontract all of that to manufacturing subcontractors, most of which are located in Southeast Asia. If you look at the toy industry, everything that they make, they don't actually make. It's subcontracted to manufacturing subcontractors, most of which are located in Southeast Asia. So the point I'm trying to make is these companies in these industries make sure that if they subcontract something, that stuff isn't being made in sweatshops by 7-year-olds that work 80 hours a week in 110-degree heat, for example. So these manufacturing subcontractors get SA8000 certified. That confirms and verifies that they have policies and procedures, documentation, and systems in place that basically protect the welfare of their workers. And they use international standards and guidelines that say the work week can be only this long. Your workers have to be at least this age. The working conditions and safety and temperature have to be this. So it lays out what those work conditions for people need to look like bare minimum. And you might think, well, everyone should be SA 8000 certified. Almost no facilities in the United States are SA 8000 certified because there's no need for it. Why would you make anyone do anything if it's not an issue to begin with in a country that's super highly regulated like the United States? It tends to be a requirement in markets and regions and countries where things are less regulated so that you can hold those facilities in those parts of the world to a standard that the rest of the world is more comfortable with. So that's SA 8000, okay? There's another one called CTPAT, Customs and Trade Protection Against Terrorism, CTPAT. CTPAT is basically a rubber stamp and a certification that the government gives you. The Department of Homeland Security and the U.S. Customs Border and Control Group, they basically work together and they basically tell, hey, anyone in America, if you're bringing stuff into America, if you have policies and procedures, systems and documentation and oversight in place from beginning to end through the entire supply chain, from the time it begins to the time it gets to your operations in the United States, if you have that kind of oversight, we'll give you a rubber stamp that says you're CTPAT certified, Customs and Trade Protection Against Terrorism. And it's expensive, it's burdensome. Basically, I'll give you an example. Lear, John Deere, Chrysler, they're CTPAT certified. They basically have complete oversight from beginning to end for everything in their supply chain from the time something is made to the time it gets to U.S. borders. They know everywhere it's been, they've got the documentation, they can track it, and they actually had oversight over the entire process. That's burdensome, that's expensive, that's a lot of money, but to them it's worth it because that way we make sure, for example, that no dirty bombs enter America and kill 3,000 people on a street corner in Midtown Manhattan. The purpose of CTPAT certification is, hey, American companies and non-American companies with operations in America, if you have complete oversight of the stuff coming into America and you can prove it to us, we'll let your stuff into the country much, much faster. Otherwise, it's going to be sitting at the docks, or it's going to be sitting on boats in the ocean, and when stuff comes to the ports, if you're CTPAT certified, we'll let that stuff in right away because we know where it's been, and you provided complete oversight that basically says Americans and American safety is not at risk because you're CTPAT certified. You've ensured that you have complete oversight of your supply chain from beginning to end when stuff comes into America. So I think that's a really cool one, and obviously that one was created after September 11th. Another one is Sarbanes-Oxley, SOX. It basically says, do you have a paper trail for all economic activity and dollar signs from beginning to end in your company? What happened is right around the time of September 11th, oddly enough, because the thing was created in 2002, SOX, certain companies that were publicly traded, where you could buy stock in them, they were lying about their financials. They didn't make mistakes on their financials, they lied about their financials. So what we've done in America, as we've said, there are certain things that can cripple the American economy. And one of those things is if our banking system just collapses, because the backbone of our economy is the ability of businesses and people and consumers to borrow money. And in 2008, when the banking system almost collapsed, the global economy almost shut down. So I would say that would be the worst thing that could possibly happen, is if the American banking system collapses. And it almost did. The other worst thing that could possibly happen is if investors don't have confidence in the financial statements of publicly traded companies so that they don't buy stocks in companies. Okay? If that happens, it's game over. Global economy shuts down. And we were very concerned that a lot of the financials that were being reported weren't accurate, and or companies were actually lying about their bottom line financial results. For example, Tyco and Enron reported expenditures as sales revenue. Think about that. They spent money, expenditures, but they called it sales revenue, and they did it intentionally. They wanted to misguide investors, and they got caught. So they created this thing called SOX, Sarbanes-Oxley, which basically says, company leadership, you have to audit and create a paper trail for all economic activity and dollar signs from beginning to end. It has to be accurate. You have to sign your name to it. And if it's not accurate, if you make a mistake and or actually lie, you might be criminally liable. In other words, you can't mess this up anymore. Now, it's a paper trail for all economic activity and dollar signs in your company. Do you think that might impact supply chain management? Of course, absolutely it does. So all these things we're talking about, like SMED, ISO 9000, 14000, SA8000, C-TPAT, SOX. These are all acronyms that sometimes you think, hey, that's a finance thing, that's an accounting thing, or that's a security thing, or that's a quality thing, or that's a pollution thing. These are all supply chain management things, believe it or not. They impact supply chain management more so than probably any other functional area within a company. The other one came from Europe. General Data Protection Regulation. Basically what this one says is when you collect data from anyone, you have to tell them why you need the data, how it's going to be used, where it's going to be stored, and how safe the data will be. Basically, anytime you ask for any information from anyone for any reason outside of your company, you have to tell them the reason and you have to give them excruciating detail on what you're going to do with their data. All right, so that's a requirement in Europe. In the United States, anyone that remotely does business with Europe, directly or indirectly, likewise has to adhere to this thing called GDPR. It's basically policies and procedures and documentation and systems in place that protect the privacy of information and data that actually belongs to someone else outside of your company. So if you ask for it, you have to say why you need it and what you're going to do with it, how it's going to be stored. When you don't need it anymore, what are you going to do with the data? It's intense. Companies that do billions a year in annual sales revenue are saying that to create these systems and maintain them costs them tens of millions of dollars annually. But maybe we could say that it's worth it because if you're going to ask for data, you better have a damn good reason. And once you get the data, you have to treat it with the privacy and the respect that it deserves. What's happening in the United States is California has created its own version of GDPR. So anyone in the United States that has nothing to do with Europe probably has something to do with California, given that if California was a country by itself, it'd be the sixth largest country on the planet. That's how big it is. California by itself is like 15% of America's GDP and economy. The point I'm trying to make is every company from small to medium-sized firms to large ones are probably right now working on creating systems that are basically policies and procedures for how they're going to deal with data. Now for you in supply chain management, when you collect information and data from a supplier, you're going to have to tell suppliers, this is what I want, this is why I need it, and this is what I'm going to do with it. And you have to explain that to them in excruciating detail. Whereas in the past, that wasn't really regulated. Moving forward, chances are that's going to be super, super, super regulated. And companies are basically saying, man, this is a lot of work. It's a lot of paperwork. It's an administrative burden. It's expensive. It's a percentage of our annual sales revenue. In other words, it's going to cut into our margins. But at the same time, if you're asking for information, you should be able to explain why, what you're going to do with it, how it's going to be stored, what you're going to do to make sure that it doesn't get into the wrong hands. It's one of those things where I hate regulation, but without the regulation, maybe they're asking for stuff that they shouldn't be, or they're getting information and not taking care of it the way that it should be taken care of. So it's just one of those things where, man, maybe the oversight is a good thing, but yeah, I hate forcing companies to do things where they have to spend money on it and it cuts into their margins. But if they're not going to do it the right way without the regulation, then maybe we need them in place. Okay, I guess wrapping it up, those were the big acronyms. That's it, I guess, on that. I think I just want to leave you with the thought that all of this stuff is out there. You need to know what it is. And when you hear about an acronym in your business classes or you're watching business news, if I had to bet, the acronym impacts supply chain management, and it might impact supply chain management more than any other part of an organization or a company. And that means that you just need to know all of them. All right, feel free to contact me if you have any more questions about any of the stuff that I just discussed. I will get you my notes in the written word, because once again, I probably went really fast and you're like, you can't remember a single acronym. For example, do you remember what SOX was? Do you remember what it is? Do you remember what GDPR is, what it stands for, and in general, what it does? How about C-TPAT? What does that do? What does it stand for? IATF 16949, that's the international quality standard for which industry? ISO 13485, that's a quality standard for which industry? How about ISO 14000? What strategic initiative does that specifically address? 14,000, did you know it was for the environment, pollution, or waste? those were questions I just rattled off where I expect you to know that SOX is Sarbanes-Oxley. I expect you to know that CTPAT is Customs and Trade Protection Against Terrorism. I expect you to know that ISO 14000 addresses pollution or waste or the environment. Why? Because managers will expect you to know, because these are key major initiatives within supply chain management. All right, thank you for your time. I will talk to you folks soon.